Hey everyone, Xerath here, and today we're going to be talking about Blackfire Torch. So, is this item good in general? Is this item good on Xerath? These are questions that I've seen asked quite a bit recently on the subreddit, on general League Reddit, Discords. I've had people ask me in the comments if I can do a video on this, so yeah, we're going to be looking at this and tackling it today. And for those that just kind of want the quick and dirty answer, I would say that the long and the short of it is that, this is not something that's going to be a mainstay in your build. So if you're worried, like, oh, is this the new strongest item on Xerath? Is it part of the core? Should I be building this every game? The answer to those questions is almost unequivocally no. That doesn't mean that the item is terrible or that maybe you should never build it, but for most games you play in, you will not be building this item. It's part of like the optimal build path. And this video we're going to kind of go into detail and in depth, and we'll talk about the use cases at the end where you may want to build it, like where it starts to become good. But if you just want like a general answer, then no, this is not like a game-breaking item, right, that you need to start incorporating into your build, so don't worry about that if that's what you're concerned about. Also, I think that this item is definitely going to be better on AP mid than support, and I'll kind of like get into why I feel that way a bit later in the video. But yeah, let's start with a couple things first. So one thing that I see, I kind of want to go over a couple, like, I call them like fallacies, I guess, which is kind of like things that you see said about an item, and they're not going to be necessarily item specific, but they're more the class or the category, and in this particular case, it's going to be burn items. So I call this like the fallacy of double burn or multiple burn. Okay, and basically the thought process is like whenever you have an item in the game, like Leandra's, for example, right, and then you get another item in the game, like Blackfire. Kind of like the thought can be, oh, well, why not just like stack the burn, double the burn, double the power, etc., right? And I think people have this tendency to like to group things together and then kind of like to, how would you say it? They kind of like to fill a certain role, and the role of like AoE or like long range burn dot damage dealer, almost maybe like a warlock or something from an MMO, sort of comes to mind here, right? And that's not really how games like this work, in my opinion. The thing about stuff like that is that when you're kind of going into that MMO territory, most of those classes are pre-built, or if the game gives you a way to build them yourself, a lot of times there's like inherent synergies between like the multiple dot abilities that kind of make sense, or just the volume of dots is like so large that either the base class benefits a lot from having multiple dots up, or if you're making a class, it would make sense to have multiple dots because like they just get stronger, like your actual damage potential on maybe multiple targets or targets where you don't actually have to be hard casting on them gets stronger with the more dots that you add, right? But this is a little bit different, right? Because these items, in my opinion, to compare them to like an MMO dot is not really the same, because most of the item stats are kind of normalized, right? So for example, if you look, it's still 90 AP, right? There's some ability haste on there, still 90 AP here. The suffering thing is going to be basically passive on this item, especially with how the dot works, right? So this is almost, you could just think of it as like passive damage that's up all the time. It's procced by the dot in a way, like it's helped by the dot in the sense that the dot helps keep it up, but it doesn't really do anything explicitly to the dot damage. It increases the dot damage, but it also increases your normal damage, right? So these are very different from like MMO dot items, where in an MMO, kind of the big advantage of using dots, and one why I might want to lean into like a dot build or multiple dots, is that they do all of their damage basically over time, which means that while you cast them, you can be doing other things in the interim, right? Whereas in this version of the game, only a small portion of the damage actually comes from a dot, and that is sort of like baked in to the balance of the item already. So for example, like when they are balancing an item like Liandry's or Blackfire, they have to account for the dot damage versus the total damage of other items, right? So the idea is that if this item costs 2,800 gold, right, there's not a lot of cases where this is going to be way, way, way better than Horizon Focus, for example, right, that costs 2,700 gold. That's not really the idea behind the item. And there's some small aspects to that, right? So, for example, you'll notice that on this item, if you hit, I believe, Shift, you see that there's AP scaling on it, right? So the idea kind of behind something like Blackfire is like, at the super high end, if you have like a lot of AP, like I'm talking like a lot, like 700, like 600-700 plus, then this item probably starts to kind of do more damage than Liandry's by a good clip. And it's kind of like the same with something like Liandry's, by Horizon Focus. And then if you have something like Liandry's Torment, it's kind of the same way with the enemy's health, right? Like the more health they have, then at that point it's where it starts to kind of get value over its base value, right? But the idea is that these items aren't insane departures from each other and the normal use case. And that's a little bit different from an MMO, because a lot of times in an MMO, the reason why dots are so strong, and therefore the idea of leaning into multiple dots, is you don't tend to lose anything by casting them, right? Because they're just extra damage that's on the target that's ticking all the time, so you can do anything else that you want while those dots are up. And like, if they give a dot class an extra dot in an MMO, it's just, most of the time it's going to be strictly better, right? Whereas if you get another dot item in League, the item still has an item budget. The the damage over time is still baked in and factored in with the other items. It's not like you're just getting free damage necessarily, because you still have to pay for the item, etc. Right? So it's a little bit of a different situation, and that's why this whole idea of like stacking dots doesn't really work in this game, because there's not a good reason to stack dots, because there's not really a gameplay mechanic that rewards dot stacking explicitly, right? People kind of have this idea where they love seeing people tick down and die to dots, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, I love killing the person with Liandry's there, he got hit and he's not dead, and then he ticks down after, and it's like you're doing all that extra damage, but it's like, in reality, in a lot of cases, you're not really doing extra damage unless the item itself is a bit potentially overtuned, like maybe Liandry's is, right? It's really more just that, like, if you went a different item route, you probably would have killed that guy anyway, in most cases, right? Assuming he's not like some Giga Tank and you're counting on the HP scaling on Liandry's to finish the job or something. But like, if you're attacking like a squishy Caitlyn, right, and you kill them with the Liandry's burn, there's also a reasonable amount of chance that if you had like Rabadons in place of that Liandry's, that you're also going to kill them as well, right? And they're just going to die instantly, which is honestly potentially better, because of all the sources of healing in this game and all the ways you can like react, right, with heal or support item shields or shields in general. So typically I feel like dots are actually worse in a game like this than they would be in an MMO, because in MMO they're basically sort of like free damage in some cases. Like, it's not entirely free damage because the class is built around having dots, but usually the class can still do pretty good damage on its own while having the dots up, is kind of like the idea, right? And in this game, they're really just like a different way to calculate or do damage, right? And so there's no real advantage of somebody dying slower when they could die faster. So that's my little spiel on like the dot fallacy. So you should really always be looking at these dot items and evaluating them kind of like by themselves and solo, right? Because there's not going to be any inherent synergy between Liandry's and Blackfire Torch. It's just that they are both dots, right? And you might get some cool meme kills taking somebody down from further than before, but you would have just killed them if you had a different item anyway. So yeah, something to keep in mind there. Always evaluate the items kind of like as they are, unless there's like a specific reason that the items have like an inherent synergy, right? And them just both being dots isn't a case of inherent synergy. So that's something there. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about, the other aspect of this I wanted to talk about before we kind of get into like the damage testing and stuff, is the Blackfire ability. So I think a decent amount of the value from this item, especially if it's going to be built early, kind of comes from, can we make use of this, or how well can we make the use of this? And I think on Xerath, it's not that like we're terrible at using this, because like pretty much all of our abilities are AoE to some degree, but they're not reliable AoE in my opinion. So the W is nice early, and it's kind of like a large radius, but once you kind of get to the mid game, you're mostly casting it on like a single target. You know, maybe there'll be a clump where you can get a W on multiple people, and you're applying like the burn to multiple people at once and stuff like that. But you know, it's really not a super common scenario. I feel like it's the same thing with the Q. You don't hit a lot of double Qs, and if you do hit double Qs, sometimes there's a question as to like the efficacy of the actual Q. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've had a scenario where I've hit like 3 or 4 people with a Q because they were CC'd in a particular fashion, right? And it feels incredible. But those situations are kind of going to be few and far between. Most of the time, your Q's hitting one person, or if it's hitting multiple people, the damage on the other person may not necessarily be relevant. You know, like if you can't consistently deal damage to the person, the last person that it hit, then is the little bit of Q damage that you did to that person super relevant? It kind of depends on like how fed you are and stuff like that. Right? In other words, like if I'm targeting like a tank that's like right here, right, and it happens to go through and hit the 80 carry behind here, if we don't have like reliable follow-up on this champion, does it even matter that he was hit? You know, I mean, it's better him being hit than him not being hit, right? Obviously, you know, him being hit can cause him to play in a different way or something like that. So I'm not saying it's completely useless, but the damage there may not be a deciding factor in the fight. So Q can be AoE, but a lot of times it's not. Alt can actually has a bigger AoE than people think. As you see, it's actually kind of fairly large. However, again, most of the time you're kind of like targeting a single target or a double target. I mean, it's really nice to be able to hit multiple targets with your R if you can. It's just going to be a situational thing, right? And there's kind of 2 components to the multi-targeting aspect when you have these burn items, right? So the first one is kind of just the burn itself applying on multiple targets. Like if you notice when you compare something like a Blackfire Torch to something like a Leandry or a Luden's Companion, there's no cooldown on this, and there's no cooldown on Leandry's Torment either, right? So basically what that means is that the more people you hit with the burn, kind of like the better, because there's, you know, you're just doing more damage in general. So there's always that aspect where that is going to give you a bit more of a damage boost than what you're going to be seeing during the testing, right? Because we're only going to be testing it on a single target during the testing, and that damage is going to be applying to 2 targets whenever you hit abilities on multiple people. So that's something that to kind of like keep in mind, right? Or keep in a lookout for. And the other thing is like, are we really going to be able to proc this Blackfire, right? Because are we going to have the dot on like multiple people for a long period of time? And my thoughts on this is just like, we're probably going to have this, we're probably going to be gaining between like 4 to 12% ability power in most cases. And in most cases, we're in the 4 to 8%, right? So if we're at 4% at that point, we're not really gaining very much. If we're at 8%, it's better. It's still not necessarily insane, but we're kind of getting there. And a lot of this is also going to depend on your ability power, like whatever it is at the time, right? And that's why, like, when we get into the damage testing, you'll kind of see that this item obviously gets better as you add more ability power, and it's not just from the Blackfire thing, but the actual base burn scales as well, right? So that's why I think that this item, it does have potential in the late game, because it being a dot item, right, it obviously is just doing the damage over time to multiple people if you hit multiple people. And then you're also gaining this ability power percent bonus, as well as the actual dot itself is scaling into something a bit more significant as you get more and more AP, right? So I do think this is an item that once you have a reasonable amount of AP, can become pretty good, but it's kind of just about getting there, right? So before we kind of talk about the super late game stuff, I want to talk about the core stuff early on, and should we be building this core, right? And I'm going to hop into that by kind of taking our other build that we had talked about in the previous video, which I will show you here. And then we're going to be like, okay, like where does this fit into that build? Could we replace anything with it? If we do, are we going to lose damage? And we'll start doing some of the damage testing there. So that's how we're going to approach this. So we'll kind of go back to the other build, the one that I said I really like, right? So we've got Ludens, we've got Leandre, and we've got Void Staff. Now remember the functional purpose of this build, right? This is your mana item, and it helps you deal burst damage, right? So that's kind of like why we buy this. And then the Leandres still does really great damage to squishies, as you remember. And then also does pretty reasonable damage to, just better damage to anything that's like kind of tanky, like Tanky Bruiser. And then for stuff that's super tank, does incredible damage on, right? So that's why we have this to kind of cover all those bases. And the extra HP is not bad at all. And then Void Staff. So we have Void Staff for penetration purposes, because remember, even on a squishy target, penetration is going to give us a lot of damage still, right? Because we don't have any other pen in this build, so this is going to be our major pen item. We're penning 40%, and then you apply that 18 flat penetration after, right? So we still get lots of damage for building a Void Staff on the squishy target. But it's also going to future-proof us if they buy a lot of magic resistance, right? And we'll be able to penetrate that quite effectively. So that's kind of like the core of our build, and that's the process. Like each of these items is like solving a problem, right? And then the not only are each of these items solving a problem, but it pretty much stays the same as, like, I would say on support or on mid, right? Because on support, the items I think are a bit more important in the sense that, you don't have as much gold, so you need to cover those bases sooner, right? And you have a bit more flexibility on what you can build as mid, but you kind of want the same thing. You want to be covering the same areas, basically, right? Now, all right, let's kind of talk about where this would fit in, right? So the most obvious thought is Luden's Companion, right? Because they're both mana items. And I think this is kind of like people's default thought. Should you build this in place of Luden's? Now, the problem I have with this, and we can do some simple testing just to show you, and we'll do it on the squishy target here, right, is that the buff to Luden's was actually quite good, and it actually just does a lot of damage now. So it'll kind of show you like the damage differential between having one item on Luden's and Sork Shoes, and then we'll compare it to the first item, Blackfire Torch. And they're very similar gold, remember, so. Okay, so. This is on a dummy, by the way. It's like the 80 carry dummy. It's 1700 health and 40 MR. So 509 damage on the Ludens, okay.
Are only distractions.
We'll sell this. Then we get Blackfire Torch. So 509 and 354. So that's a huge damage differential. Now, again, there's some caveats to this, right? Because Ludens has a cooldown. It's not an insignificant cooldown. It's 12 seconds. So obviously, you're not going to, if you fire multiple Qs, right, you're going to get the burn on this every time, and you're not going to get the damage on Ludens every time, right? If you hit multiple targets, the Ludens damage is either splitting onto the targets or all stacking onto the primary target, right? Whereas this just applies the burn to the target's hit, right? So there's no, like, you're basically just gaining more damage by hitting multiple people with Blackfire. That's not the case with Ludens. You don't do the damage double, it just splits the damage, right? So those are two important things to keep in mind. But again, in most cases, we're hitting single targets, right? And in most cases, unless we're sieging and we have a shooting gallery, we're not really able to just repeat vomit out Qs into the crowd. Like a lot of times we're in that mid game, the important part of the game in my opinion, we're trying to poke people out around mid. We don't get to just reload constantly and like fire the next shot and have a ton of people sitting around waiting to be hit, right? So you're probably benefiting from the Ludens proc at least one every 2 shots, I would say, one every 2 successfully hit shots. So the disparity of not having enough for every shot, it's not quite as bad as you would think, right? And obviously there's just a value in having that burst damage on a target, whether it comes to the actual team fighting situation, right? Where that's kind of like where you want your damage to be front loaded, right? Whether you're executing somebody at the end of the fight or starting the fight off, right? I think there's obviously a benefit to having that bit of extra burst damage there. So I think that Ludens kind of like wins for the mana item that you want to build. Now, the next use case would be like, okay, well, let's say we have Ludens as part of the core build, right? So let's build Liandry's next. I think this is going to be the most relevant test, right? Because remember, this is going to be, this is the item that you kind of would expect to build for anti-tank, right? And this item right here is the Blackfire Torch. It's kind of like the equivalent version of the item, but it's not for tank, it's just for people in general. So you're thinking, oh, well, you know, maybe this actually does kind of like more damage on squishy targets or something like that, right? And if you notice, it does have mana, which is eating into its item budget, but Liandry's has health, which is also eating into its item budget. Now, obviously, you probably would rather have the 300 health than the 600 extra mana, as opposed to going double mana item. However, it's not going to affect your damage, the 300 health, right? So it should be interesting to see the damage of the Liandry's here, right? So we're going to shoot the target. And we have 688, okay, with those two items. 688. And then we're going to sell the Liandry's. Now keep in mind that this is 200 gold cheaper, right? So there's something to factor in. But it's not going to be hugely significant. Okay, so 688.
That hold the universe together.
643. So it's like 40 damage different, right? But the problem is really here is that this is on kind of like the best case scenario for Blackfire Torch, right? So I wouldn't say the best case scenario because obviously the best case scenario is that you have all of your ability power stacks, right? And that you have more AP in general. But I'm talking about if we're building this as a second item, the only thing that could be done to increase the damage here is to have the burn on multiple targets, which isn't always going to be available. And even when you compare that to Liandry's, right, we're not comparing the damage here of this when it's at full suffering stacks. Like, we're obviously gaining the suffering benefit on the tail end of the dot damage on this, but we're not gaining the percent damage on the initial hit, right? So just something to keep in mind there, right? And we're already kind of losing, right, by 40 damage. And like I said, it doesn't cost as much, but we're losing already. And the moment this thing gets more health, or the moment, it's basically more health. MR wouldn't really factor in this particular case, but yeah, the moment this dummy gets more health, or the target gets more health, you're now doing way more damage with Liandry. So if it's against a tankier team, or we're trying to future-proof, right, you can see just from this test that it's not really the best item to have, right, the Blackfire Torch. You'd much rather have the Liandry's. And keep in mind, the Liandry's, the burn works the same way as the Torch, right? So it's not like there's a proc to proc the Liandry's burn that you don't need to have with the Torch. Like, both of them, if you hit a target with them, if you hit multiple targets, the burn's going on multiple of them, right? So, yeah, just something to keep that in mind there. And then here's the next item that we might replace it with. So we've actually established right now that we want Liandry's, most likely we want Ludens, right? So let's take the Void Staff. Okay. And we'll shoot the target with the Void Staff, and then we'll shoot it with the Blackfire, because this is going to be simulating having it in place of our third item, the Void Staff. And again, this is going to be a very favorable situation for the Blackfire Torch, because the more we increase the MR on this dummy, the worse it would get, right? Because obviously the Void Staff gets better. So even in the worst case scenario on the squishy target, we have 873, right? And then we will get the Blackfire Torch out. We will shoot. So 873 versus 805. So quite a significant difference, as you can see. And yeah, I mean, the Void Staff kind of has the same thing going for it too as these burn items, right? Now, there's not an extra effect on the Void Staff, it's just penetration. But the penetration is applying in all cases, just like the burn would apply in all cases. So if I hit multiple targets having the Void Staff, right, it's kind of like the same thing as hitting multiple targets having the Blackfire Torch. It's just I'm going to be doing more damage up front with the Void Staff damage as opposed to the burn being on multiple targets. But we're not losing anything there because the penetration on the Void Staff isn't based on a proc or something. It's happening at all times, right? So as you can see, the Void Staff just comes out on top. And again, this is for the worst case scenario, right? The more MR we get, the better the Void Staff is. So basically, what this means is that our core build is probably not going to change, right? Because we need the burst from the Ludens. We want that, right? It's really strong. We need the HP shredding power of the Leandry, and we need the magic penetration of the Void Staff or some equivalent item like Crypt Bloom or something like that, right? Now, I think if you did have to replace one of these items, okay, it may be better for the overall scope of the game, if we're choosing to replace one, to replace the Ludens, right? However, personally, I think that giving up that much burst damage in the early game is very bad. And especially on support Xerath, I think it's terrible. The reason is because when you first hit that power spike, especially right now, it actually feels really good. You can really chunk people out, and the chunk damage, I feel like, is what's important, because that's what helps get kills on ganks. It's what helps you catch people, right, when you're hitting people with your ult or your Q, right? That first shot dealing a lot of damage is really good. So there's a lot of advantages to having that strong burst damage in the early. And you're not even necessarily going to be full-scale team fighting that much in the early game. You're going to be doing a lot of mid-game poking, small-scale skirmishes. So Ludens definitely comes out on top in those situations, in my opinion. Because, again, for this item to really shine, you want to be having the burn on multiple people, right? And even when you have the burn on multiple people, it's like you may be doing more damage overall, but are you doing relevant damage to the priority target? And that's kind of like a big thing in this game, right? Target selection, I can make a whole video on that. But I think overall, Ludens is just the more effective damage dealer early, so I would not sub this out for Ludens. But if I'm just saying, in terms of a complete overall build, if I had to sub this out for one of the items, I would sub it out for Ludens, because the other two items are just, they're helping you deal with so many other things in the game that if you don't have them, playing against those things like tanks and stuff like that, it's just going to feel really, really bad. So just something to note there on the core build. Now, when does this item kind of like start to pick up, right? So I already kind of tested this a little bit before to abbreviate the video a little bit. And it's basically around when you get like around 400 AP, I would say. So what we're going to do is we're going to sell this back, right? And we're going to buy this. And then we're going to buy, I believe this, yeah. It's 405, right? So at around this point, actually, we're going to have to sub this out with something else. Alright, yeah. So what we're going to do here is we're going to do a test with Blackfire, and we're going to do a test with Leandry's. And we're going to show you that around 400 AP on a squishy target, they do approximately the same damage, right? And at this point, since they're doing approximately the same damage, Blackfire is kind of the more gold efficient item as opposed to Liandry's, because it costs less, right? So we'll just do a little bit of a test here. So wait for this. Make sure we're max range. Okay, so 1061 with Blackfire, right? And then sell this. 1061. Wait for everything to come back up again. Again, this is just for the the focus passive, but we'll let it cool down just so people don't get nervous. So 1061. And then 11, 13. So we still are doing a bit more damage with the Liandry's, as you can see. So we'd have to actually add even more AP to kind of get that differential down. But it's starting to get a bit close. It is sort of the idea there, right? So if you add a little bit more AP, it'll get closer. So maybe actually it's more like 450 or something like that. Maybe the first test was a little off because this seems to be a little bit different. So I'd say like 450, 500 AP is where we start seeing parity. But again, that is only on very, very squishy targets. Like the moment this dummy gets more HP, and obviously even a character's base health, I think right now with no runes or anything, it's like 1900 or like 2k late game. So this is going to increase like even in the late game, right? Like this is very mid-game health for most characters. It's even a squishy character because they're probably going to have HP runes or something like that. So, yeah, like the moment you start getting into like 2.2k HP, even like 2k HP, 2.5k HP, Liandry's is still beating this out for quite a large bit. Now, if you have something insane, right, like 600, 700, 800 AP, that's where this particularly does a lot of work, and it'll start to surpass items like Horizon Focus and stuff like that. Now the problem is, and this is going to be coming back to why I think the item is probably better on mid than it is on support, right, is that on support you don't really have the space for that, right? Because so you're trying to obviously cover all your bases on support, but you're also trying to be gold efficient. And one of the most gold efficient things you can do is buy a Dark Seal and just stay alive, right? Obviously. So typically your build late game on support is going to look like Boots, Ludens, Liandry's, Void Staff, Dark Seal, and then you're going to have a support item here, obviously, right? And then you could eventually upgrade this into a Magi's late game, and then what I do late game, like I mentioned in the last video, is I'll sell my boots for Rabadons. However, you can see even in this build, right, you don't actually have a way to incorporate the Blackfire Torch into the build because you're going to have the support. I mean, you need that no matter what because it gives you your wards, right? Very important. Selling your boots and giving you Rabadons, you pretty much have to sell this to buy Rabadons because this is what's giving you the huge multiplier, right? It's not worth it to sell the boots probably to build Blackfire Torch, really. You'll do slightly more damage for sure, but your movement speed is completely a gap. So the idea is if we're going to be selling our movement speed boots, right, we want an item that's going to give us a lot of power and a big multiplier. So that's why we sell it for Rabadons, essentially. And ideally, this would already be a high-stacked Magi's at that point. And that's where we can kind of get into those crazy 800-900 AP ranges. But that's 800-900 AP with all of our item slots being used. So we don't actually have a slot for something like Blackfire Torch. You could sell your boots and get a Blackfire Torch here. Like I said, that would be more damage than having your boots, right? And it would be more damage than putting a different item in here that wasn't a Magi's. So if you're going to have like a Horizon Focus here instead of a Dark Seal going into a Magi's, then yes, in the hyper late game where you sold your boots for Rabadons, then this item would be better off as a Blackfire Torch than something like a Horizon Focus. But we're already getting into very, very niche, very weird situational builds, as you can tell, right? Whereas like on mid, it's not quite as bad, right? Because in mid, if you do this build, you get the Dark Seal, right? Then you could just build a Blackfire Torch here. You'd already start doing a bit more damage. You could build a Rabadon's here, right? And then you maybe don't have Dark Seal, and you build a torch here. If the team is not squishy, right, you could build a Rabadon's in place of the, or sorry, if the team is squishy, you could build a Rabadon's in place of the Liandry. You could potentially even replace the Void Staff with something else. You would have the Magi's here with a high amount of stacks, and then you could build a Blackfire on top of that, right? So if you had like a really squishy team, you could even do something like Shadow Flame here or Storm Surge, right? And then you could do Rabadon's here. You could have a fully stacked Magi's, and then you would have Blackfire Torch, and Blackfire Torch would probably be one of the best candidates you could have in that slot. At that point, it would probably outdamage the Liandry's on just squishy targets, right? Not to mention you're also getting a bit more mana, a bit more ability haste. So things like that can work on the mid Xerath route, but it's just not really a super realistic build. Like, there's not many games where you're getting to that amount, and you kind of have to pre-plan it in advance, right? And there's a lot of cases, again, where you're going to want these core items. So even if you go mid-Xerath, right, you're probably going to want these core items in a Dark Seal. And then for this extra item, it's like, you're probably just going to want, like, a Rabadon's, honestly. Because a Rabadon's, in most cases, is going to give you more damage and better burst damage, absolutely, than something like a Blackfire Torch, in most cases at least. Like, sure, you know, if you build this here as the last item, you have a 25 stack Magi's, and you hit 3 targets or something like that, like crazy, you know, 4 targets, you've got the extra percent AP on the item, right? You're like really crushing, then you're able to hit another ability in the window you're doing that, or maybe like you hit an ult that hits 4 people on the first shot. Now you have 4 stacks of Blackfire, and you still have a bunch of other ult shots to go, and they're all going to be able to be used within the time where that buff you have is still up on you, right? The 16% additional AP. All those types of like niche circumstances, the item can definitely be better. But in terms of like what's going to consistently allow you to do really high primary focus damage on a single target, I think Rabadon is just going to be better in most cases, right? And most of the time you're kind of going to build in a way where you're building towards that. You're not really going to be building into the torch itself. Another thing you could do potentially is if it's a game where your Magi's or Dark Seal route is going to be kind of suspect, like you think you're eventually probably going to take a death or something, if you don't need to build something like Zanya's, you could potentially build the torch in here, and that would actually probably be a good build. Like if you're not going to be able to maintain high Dark Seal stack or high Magi stack uptime, and you don't need a defensive item, right, then I could definitely see the 6th item in a build like this where you have Rabadons in this slot, the last build being a Blackfire Torch, okay? So that's another situation where I think it could kind of work. And again, that's taking into account I don't need anything like Heal Cut, which in a lot of games you need, and stuff like that, right? So there's a lot of variables here, but the too long didn't read version is basically that the circumstances that are going to have to come together to make Blackfire better are probably going to be pretty rare in most cases. So you probably shouldn't be building it on Xerath very often. Yeah. That is basically the case. I hope you guys learned something from this video. We kind of bore it out with the math in most of the cases. We didn't go into the absolute extreme cases, but that's kind of because obviously in a case where you have 16% additional AP from the Blackfire item, plus you already have a ridiculous amount of base AP, right? So therefore the multiplier is multiplying more, and you're getting a higher base damage from the Blackfire Torch because the just the scaling damage on the burn is higher. Like obviously in both of those cases the item is going to be really good, right? But it's just how often are we actually getting to those cases? Just not very often. Certainly not going to be a part of your core build. And yeah, so you don't really have to worry about this item too much. Play around with it if you want, but remember that it's not really serving a purpose in your core. And although the double burn shenanigans can feel nice and funny at sometimes, you're probably doing just as much damage, more damage with another item, and you are doing like really great priority damage, right? Having things like Ludens and the penetration and everything like that that you wouldn't necessarily have with something like a Blackfire torch. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Sorry if this is a bit on the longer side, but kind of wanted to be comprehensive with it. We only go long if we need to. So thank you for watching. I hope you guys learned something. And yeah, if you like, comment, subscribe if you like what's going on here. And see you guys next time.